Hello, my name is Craig Gurney and I'm joined today by my colleague Adriana Soaita. We're here to present a presentation for the inaugural Evidence Network for Renting virtual conference. The title of our presentation today is Social Suffering, Harm and Home in the Private Rented Sector. Before we start, we just, both of us would like to say thank you very much for the opportunity to present at this inaugural conference, and we're looking forward to hearing other people's presentations and taking part in the discussion later on. The format for our presentation is quite simple. Adriana will speak for about 7 minutes, and then I will speak for about 7 minutes, and then we'll have a brief discussion between the two of us, a brief conversation, and then we'll open it up for a wider discussion. Okay, so Adriana, when you're ready, can you please start sharing your slides? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Greg. In today's presentation, I want to reflect on some widespread deficiencies in the PRS, which create what should be described as a form of social suffering, and what make tenants practically homeless. Even so, they pay high rents to keep a roof over their heads. I will report on hard evidence collected through 3 cash projects. In 2, I personally interviewed 33 low-income tenants in England and Scotland who also sent us 247 photographs that make testimonies of the poor housing conditions they endure. I also report on the experiences of more than 1,900 tenants in the UK and other similar countries, as we reviewed in 65 publications with Kim McKay and Moira Munro from the University of Stirling and Glasgow. I will start today my talk with the widespread issue of disrepair. We had many testimonies of the poor conditions suffered by low-income, but also middle-income tenants. Mice infestation, mold and damp, broken white good, poor furnishing, and so on and so forth. I only present you one quotation. I sent you 5 pictures of the bathroom. I wanted you to see how old-fashioned it is. Half the ceiling is coming off. The grounding is old. You can't clear. There is no shower. We use an attached shower because it's just nice to have a shower in the 21st century. And around the toilet, there is always a urinal smell. You have to clean every other day. I feel stressed, frustrated, anxious, angry. We get angry quite a lot whenever I stop to think about those repairs and things. However, the worst condition that we found were in Australia, US, New Zealand, where social housing is negligible, hence the most vulnerable tenants must rent privately. And there is plenty of evidence that the market just does not work at this bottom end of the PRS. There is gaps in the wall. There is gaps in the floorboard. It's substandard furnished, exceedingly miserable and bloody cold. But that seems to be the standard, tell us a tenant from Australia. With such testimony strongly argued, there is no comfort, no choice, no control over the quality of the environment of this bottom end of the PRS. There is therefore no home, since these are some of its essential qualities. The insecurity given by the ease with which landlord can evict, it's well known, and is still not recognized by policies, because a rented dwelling is seen first and foremost as the landlord property rather than the tenant's home. But insecurity deeply affects tenants, as we can see in this quotation. Eviction creates depression, and It's not compatible with the nature of getting older. And indeed, more and more tenants do so in the UK. Relocation, it's also expensive and it's not easy. You have to go through this process all the time of being interviewed by people. And if you aren't exactly what somebody's looking for, you internalize that feeling that maybe there is something wrong with you. The fear of eviction, it's also unsettling. You just don't get fully invested to get all your stuff out. You'll still be kind of living in suitcases and boxes. Clearly, real or feared eviction hanging on one's head is a form of social suffering, and it brings anxiety, it brings loss of self-worth, it brings alienation from home. And yet, we should recognize that the need to personalize is there, whether one is a tenant or a homeowner. And we found moving evidence on how assembling things thrown away by others into bookshelves and sofas, as you can see on these pictures, give a sense of self, a sense of achievement, despite their obvious transiency. I do not tire at repeating, landlords, please make a standard for providing shelves, hooks, picture rails. It seems so little, but really it means so much. Besides a need for better furnishing lets, we found a less known need for unfurnished properties. Unfurnished properties allow tenants to make a home of their own. And this is indeed the standard in countries which well-regulated PRS, which gives security of tenure, such as Germany, Denmark, to name just 2 countries. We found that there is a group of tenants, particularly those with children and those who already rented for a long time, who crave to put their own stamp on the places they inhabit. And they have done so, even though the risk of being evicted hangs over their heads. And by doing this, they get a sense of well-being, a sense of achievement. And this is what you can read in this quotation. Finally, it's done, and I love it. Linda did all this with her own hands, using creativity and imagination, because she had very little money available. She and her teenager daughter have always craved for personalizing their home, and now they did it for the first time in their life. Even so, the risk of eviction looms in the horizon. I'm not ending my presentation with the classic policy recommendation, because if decision makers want to allow tenants to make a home into PRS, they know what is required. Affordable rents, security of tenure, decent standards of living. But I would argue we found that a broader cultural shift is needed to think again about homes as homes and not as assets, whether the home is rented or owned. We also found that tenants are getting better organized to press for regulatory and cultural change. There is a lot of growing interest in the housing issues and the private rented sector through tenants' unions and organizations that are springing up around the country to give power to renters. I think that provides a space for potential change, because ultimately there is so many of us in this country that are renters. COVID and no COVID. Here is where I see the hope. Tenants do not anymore just wait for the change to be given, but they vocally demand it. And I showed the German flag because participants saw Germany as the model to follow. And I would close this presentation by just saying that the COVID crisis has only shown that this change is possible, even in the UK. And with this, I thank you for watching. You see here on the slide some references I referred to. And now it is my pleasure to give the screen to Greg, who will take this presentation further to develop the idea of harm.
Thank you very much indeed, Adriana. That was fascinating. Right, so this is the opening slide of my presentation. So my part looks at ideas of harm. So I've called my part of the presentation Harm, Home and the Private Rented Sector. And the presentation essentially develops some ideas in a recently published Cash working paper, which you can see on the screen in front of you. And what I try to do there is present a theoretical perspective on how we can think about what happened and what's happening during the COVID-19 lockdown, and particularly in relation to how we think about home during times of social distancing. So what I want to do is as an exercise in critical thinking, really, to apply that perspective, to apply that harm from home perspective, and think about that in relation to research that we can undertake in the private rented sector in this time of crisis. So my second slide really speaks to this focus upon harm. The quote there in red at the start, if you don't quote yourself, no one else is going to quote you, is the motto I was always taught. I tried to develop a geography of harm perspective. What that means is this. By geography of harm, what I mean is the relations between and within the spaces where physical, mental, social, moral and material injuries or detriments occur. So I'm drawing on a slightly different citation network to Adriana, although essentially we're looking at similar things here. As I said, I'm not drawing here on any primary data. This is a kind of conceptual reflective piece. My focus is on harm and not suffering. It's on structural violence and not symbolic violence. So this social harm perspective, or it's often called zemiology, has emerged from critical criminology, the work of people like Hilliard. And there's a quote here, which I'm not going to read out. I'll pick up some of the key words, but it's about local and national states and how their impact upon people's lives, whether in respect of, I quote, lack of wholesome food, inadequate housing or heating, low income, and so on. Okay, so it's a very particular perspective on thinking about or rethinking criminology and rethinking what crime is. So this much broader perspective of harm. And we can define harm thus: events or instances where human flourishing is demonstrably compromised or the non-fulfillment of specific needs leads to identifiable harms. That comes from Pemberton's work, which draws on the earlier work of kind of Marxist contributions in relation to thinking about human needs from people like Doyle and Goff. So that's the focus. From that focus in the paper, I developed three different types of harm, which I just want to reflect upon here: physical mental health harms, autonomy harms, and relational harms. And in the remainder of this presentation, I just want to focus on two examples, really, of how we can apply this harm perspective to think about what's happening in the private rented sector. So in other words, can this offer a new lens, a new angle of attack, if you like, to understand how we might research the big issues in the private rented sector? So the first one of these two examples concerns unintentional injuries and the direct health consequences of disrepair. So what we've got here is a table which shows a percentage of stock which in various different ways is lacking in quality. It's very, very difficult, I think, to make comparisons between England, Scotland and Wales, as you can see on this table, because the definitions of unfitness and the nomenclature of unfitness vary. But what you do see here is, it's probably more insightful, I think, to read vertically across this table rather than horizontally. But in every instance, in England, Scotland and in Wales, there is a concentration of dwellings which are in poorer repair, okay? So why is this important? Well, it's important because, you know, when we think about home, this notion of home, it's frequently described, isn't it, in the literature, as a place of security and safety. But let's not forget, it's also the place where deaths from unintentional injuries most frequently take place, trips and falls, things like that. And respiratory diseases due to exposure to damp, mold, etc. are also contracted. So I think it's important to reflect that the experience of harm is uneven across 10 years, but also within 10 years. So what I'm suggesting here is that there may be particular sorts of harm which are more prevalent in the private rented sector. Secondly, the second example I want to think about concerns this growing interest across housing research and housing policy, this interest in mental health and well-being. Some references there. An earlier Cash report by Priest and Bimpson produced a really interesting systematic review of the literature in this field. I think when we talk about this potential for harm in relation to poor mental health, inevitably we start to turn towards ideas about insecurity. Okay, and what do we mean by housing insecurity? And also, of course, ontological security and insecurity. And at the heart of this is an idea that not having ownership and control of a particular dwelling may imply some sense of loss of feeling grounded. Okay, and there is some evidence to suggest that this 10-year specific ontological security may, in the scheme of things, contribute to poor mental health and undermining ideas of well-being. So I think when we look at the proposed legislation to strengthen tenant security across the UK, that's been very much tied up in the narrative of security and insecurity, and I think this is a way to think about uncertainties in relation to evictions and the end of tenancy during the COVID lockdown. So some ideas. I'm going to throw this out for discussion, really, an agenda for further research. I think the first question I'd like to pose is, well, is the experience of harm 10-year specific? Might we expect different sorts of harm to be more prevalent, or people to be more exposed to those harms in rental 10 years rather than ownership 10 years? Can we talk about the idea of there being harmed communities? These are either physical, spatial communities or kind of ideological or social communities. Is that a useful concept? I think it's insightful to think about landlords' experiences of harm in terms of mitigating kind of risk, particularly kind of smaller scale landlordism. Think about, unpick, in the way I've done here with these two examples in the short amount of time I've got, unpick the types of harm that we may be able to identify in the private rented sector. And then finally, I think the big one for me, has the meaning of home changed for tenants in the private rented sector post-lockdown? Having gone through this, do they feel differently about where they live now? And that very much speaks to Adriana's points. So these slides, the working paper, are very much work in progress. I would really welcome any comments or suggestions you might have. There's some further references there. I'm going to stop screen sharing now. And I think Adriana may have a question for me. Is that right? Or some questions for me?
Yes, Craig. I think your concept, it's by no means very interesting, and you can develop and can be very useful to further research. But what I would like you, if you want to reflect more, because you already mentioned some newer specificities of home harms. So you mentioned about poor standards in the PRS, then home ownership and social housing. But what you think also about the other type of harms that you mentioned? Yeah, health, relational, and autonomy. How what specificities they can have across the three main tenures in the UK: social and private renting and home ownership?
I think this is, for me, is the fascinating thing about the harm perspective, is it brings a particular lens to bear when we think about housing and understanding housing inequality. And I think that yes, there are concentrations of poverty, there are concentrations of inequality which impact upon people in different tenures differentially. So there is variation within 10 years and there's variation across 10 years. I think the examples that I drew upon, particularly I think in relation to disrepair, we can see that there are concentrations of disrepair. You know, I know in terms of the research that you've discussed and the photographs you showed, clear evidence of disrepair, damp, mould there, and we know that that disproportionately affects that 10 years. So I think no simple short answer for you, but I think it's a perspective which allows us to think about housing inequalities in different ways. Thank you. I need to ask you a question as well, if I may, because and I was fascinated by your presentation, and it really resonated for me with ideas of home, of course. It's at the heart of what we both do. So for you, do you think that the meaning of home is tenure specific? You said that it is more difficult to sustain a sense of feeling at home in the private rented sector. Could you say a bit more about that?
Yeah, I would start by saying that my earlier research focused on the meanings of home, and then actually I moved towards the practices of homemaking, because this reveals more what is going on in the real life and how we think and how we do home. So the answer to your question, for me, it's quite clear: both yes and no. So the meaning of home and practices of homemaking is not tenure specific. In countries like Germany, Denmark, Sweden, where private rented sector, it's very well regulated. It gives equal security of tenure like to home ownership or social housing or housing associations. For instance, if the dwelling it's sold with the tenant, it doesn't affect tenure security for the tenant. Tenants have the right to decorate and even paint the walls, so that if you ask a German this question, he or she would not even understanding, because it's so obvious there are no difference. Your rented home, it's a home as fully as if it's owned. However, my answer would be yes, it is tenure specific in countries as UK, Australia, US, New Zealand, where the sector is not regulated. Tenants don't have security of tenure. They have no control on any aspect of their life, privacy, repairs. And to come back at the point of this repair you made, for instance, we found that tenants feel much more loss of worth when these repairs are not addressed, because in similar research to home ownership, it proves that it's something in your own home, it's in disrepair, but it's you who decide not to repair. It's not as disturbing. Yeah. And of course, in this equation, private renting, home ownership, it comes the third term in certain countries, which is social housing. Again, social housing or private renting is no difference in Sweden, Denmark, Netherlands, but it's very different in countries like the UK, Australia, New Zealand. And a good point for the UK, there is still a social renting sector of quite some size compared to the other countries, which makes that, or means that the most vulnerable still have a little more chance to make a home in the social rental housing. Also, we know that more and more vulnerable people and homeless people find their home in the private rental sector.
Brilliant. Thank you for that. I mean, there's so much to say here, and you and I know we could speak for hours about this now, couldn't we? But I don't think that's the purpose of this event. But I mean, I think the takeaway there, I guess, issues about, you know, can we think about alienation of home, from home, think about regulation, wider debates about tenure. So I guess at this point we should conclude and say to people that we're going to be here for the live chat and the discussion. I'd certainly love to continue this conversation. Yeah, on Thursday. Yeah, well, we'll continue this discussion then. But thank you for your time.
Please come with your questions.
Yes. Thank you, Adriana. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Lovely.